Okay, hi, good morning, and welcome. My name is Dr. Art Trembanis. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware. I'm delighted to be able to be here with you all today. This is my first time at any con, and I was really looking forward to being able to be in person, as I'm sure you all were. But COVID-19 had other thoughts, and so again, I want to welcome you all, and just for reference here, this is my background is chosen specifically to be of topical relevance today. This is the colored seafloor map of the Bikini Atoll, the lagoon in Bikini Atoll. I actually have a 3D print of it here, and actually right now my head's in the middle of an atomic bomb crater. From the 1946 test of the Baker bomb, 25 kiloton bomb, which was the first underwater test of a nuclear weapon. And I'm going to be going through some slides presenting about the work that my team and I, collaborative team, were involved in almost exactly a year ago. It was early June, most of June last year, and it's just appeared recently on a episode of this series, Drain the Oceans, on Nat Geo. So if you want to, definitely want to encourage and mention that series for folks to check out. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen here, and let's go ahead and get this started. Here we go. Okay, hopefully you'll all be able to see. Oh, what happened there? Share screen, let's try that again. And back to, okay, here we are, back in the presentation mode. And let me see if I can get a little annotation to go to help spotlight. So atomic bombs at Bikini, the headlines, in July of 25th of 1946, headlines in newspapers around the world rang with the news of the atomic bomb testing in Bikini Atoll, where the fifth atomic bomb and the first in-water test had just been conducted. This is the famous mushroom cloud picture of that Baker test. I'm sure probably many of you have seen that. And news accounts tallied a box score of damaged and sunken ships, because at that time, the sixth largest fleet in the world had been amassed and assembled to provide themselves as targets for this nuclear testing. And these ships were amassed as sitting ducks in a nuclear blast barrel. Now today, we're almost 74 years later. We're going to revisit this site and help sort of complete the story and the untold story of the conditions of the seabed with this new comprehensive mapping effort that we've done here for this site. And in doing so, my hope in this session and in our discussion is that we can reconnect to a moment at the dawn of the Cold War and the dawn of the nuclear age, the earliest moments of the Cold War, and that with these new findings, we're going to provide a unique and previously unknown insights into the awesome power and the extensive consequences, untold and unexpected consequences that come from those testings in terms of those impacts on the environment, to the ships, and on the fallout on the displaced peoples affected by this. And this was, as again I mentioned, this was just released on Nat Geo on the series Drain the Ocean. It's a really neat series. They just started season 3. I think if you have Disney Plus or other access to Nat Geo channel, you can watch it. They refer to it as the Drain the Atomic Ghost Fleet. This involved a multi-institutional collaborative effort between oceanographers like myself, archaeologists, and a production team. And again, here's this colorful background, which we'll get to know a bit further here. So let's see if I can move here into my slides. This is what Bikini Atoll looks like today. If you were to go and visit this island here in the Marshall, this set of small islands, the atoll in the Marshall Islands chain in the Western Pacific, and it's a very remote and sort of idyllic. This was a drone shot that I took last summer as the sun was setting. And it's actually a drone image that the sun is setting towards the western side of the atoll, where in 1954 it would have been erupting with an even brighter image from the 1954 hydrogen bomb testing, which we'll get into there as well. So this is what Bikini looks like today. So if I say Bikini Atoll, for me, this is kind of the image that kind of comes to mind. But Bikini exists in our popular, collective social memory and our social discourse in so many different ways. If I were to ask my kids or folks of their age group to have a word association with bikini, they probably think, well, that's where SpongeBob lives in Bikini Bottom. If I go back to another generation, they might think to Brian Hallen's 1960, said the itsy bitsy teeny weeny yellow polka dot bikini. And if you go back even further, of course, bikini is connected very directly to a topic that's probably maybe more relevant to folks here with the Balticon, and that is it was very much closely associated with the genesis story of Godzilla. Now, I grew up watching the Godzilla movies avidly as a kid, and so when I had the opportunity with my team, we were asked if we would be willing to go, halfway around the world to a very remote area and see if we could help map the seafloor in Bikini. I sort of jumped at it because in my mind, I could associate that with Godzilla, that somehow the Godzilla was this Japanese culture responding to not only the nuclear, the atomic bombs that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also in the testing that happened later on in 1954, where a Japanese fishing vessel, the Lucky Dragon, and unfortunately named Lucky Dragon, was in the areas when the testing, some of the additional testing was going on Bikini, and that ship and the sailors suffered from the fallout of it. And so, Bikini in many ways has, of course, we also know that it's part of a French designer decided that the name Bikini was fitting for this new very small bathing suit, because it was thought that it would explode onto the beach or into the minds of beachgoers much in the same ways. And I think in some ways this reappropriation of bikini in popular culture has done it's a double-edged sword. It's sort of kept the name alive, but it's very much changed or distorted or pulled us away from some of those other connections. And so it's trying to reconnect to some of the other ways, other things that bikini really was that I hope to sort of get through here today. And in fact, this is the bikini that I really want to talk to today. So 74 years ago, the otherwise tranquil and idyllic lagoon of Bikini Atoll was ground zero for the first underwater nuclear test, a bomb that was called Helen of Bikini. Now, Bikini was chosen because of its remoteness, the large, easily accessible lagoon. And here more than 240 target ships were assembled, including German and Japanese ships, and those were done with a very important symbolism in mind. And again, here this is just in the immediate moments of that. This is looking from Bikini Island back into the lagoon, and a number of ships that you can see arrayed here. This black patch here has been sometimes erroneously interpreted as being one of the battleships going vertical. Instead, it's just sort of the gap left as that cloud was going up from it. And so we're going to talk about some of those ships and really the amazing way in which this experiment was put together. In a microsecond, as the bomb detonated, a flash of blinding light, and not really captured here in this black and white image, flash of blinding light erupted, temperature soared into several million degrees, water was vaporized and then collapsed into a bubble that formed, and more than 2 million tons of water, sand, and pulverized coral shot into the air in a column more than 900 feet across as the Wilson cloud developed. Hot winds then raced across the surface, followed by a series of tsunami-like waves. This was, in fact, the first base surge ever developed, as again, this was the 5th nuclear atomic bomb ever tested, but the first that was done underwater. And of course, what goes up must come down. So then that column of water, sand, and coral came crashing back down, and further smashing anything that was unlucky enough to be in that blast zone, and left signs on the seafloor that we can still see today for the first time. And this thus ended the test of what was called Operations Crossroads. There had been plans for a third deep water test, but because of the severe fallout, this was really the world's first major fallout, aquatic fallout disaster following the 2 bombs that were dropped during the war. And it ended the Operations Crossroads, where these tests that were designed and heavily orchestrated to really unveil the bomb. These tests in 1946 were really the debutante ball moments for the bomb, because the bombs that were used in 45, the previous year, to bring Japan to sue for peace, those were done under more of the cloak of darkness of the war. And this was an opportunity to really bring the atomic power onto the world stage. And yet in many ways, the experiment didn't end with Baker. It merely initiated the start of a longer undocumented experiment to see how the marine environment, how the ships would or would not recover from those powerful forces unleashed by the nuclear weapons. And that experiment continues to this day, and it's that experiment that I want to reveal to you. And I'll leave you also with this quote. Bob Hope at the time quipped, he said, "As soon as the war ended, we located the one spot on Earth that had been untouched by war and blew it to hell." So let's get a little deeper into, again, it's a little bit of the historical context of it. Of course, it's really grew out of the testing and the program in Alamogordo and in the deserts of New Mexico with Robert Oppenheimer and the Manhattan project testing. But again, that was done, under more sort of secrecy. Then we lead to the battle deployment of the first atomic bombs here on Hiroshima that was dropped by Enola Gay. And these are identical to the kinds of weapons that were then tested the following year in Bikini. So post-war, the U.S., the Department of Defense really, again, wanted to have an opportunity to explore more on how the details of atomic bombs. So they searched throughout the Pacific for a place. Actually, they at one point considered other locations, and even the sites in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. And then decided they would instead look for some places even more remote. And they, after quite a bit of searching around, they settled on Bikini, which was not uninhabited. There were about 160 Marshallese Bikinians who were living there at the time, and the U.S. military forces arrived and asked on bended knee, or more like told the Bikinians that they wanted to borrow their islands for the good of mankind, and the Bikinians agreed. And I think they certainly didn't think at the time that this was going to be, still 74 years later, that they are the world's first nuclear refugees and still haven't been able to return to their native ancestral homes. But that is in fact what happened. We'll return to that as well. So Operation Crossroads brought together, was really an amazing operational undertaking, amassing hundreds of ships of different sizes and classes, and with a very precise scientific structure. They wanted to look at what would happen. The sort of the military question that was ongoing is you had the now U.S. Air Force, which was the U.S. Army Air Force, and the Army saying, well, we've got atomic weapons, you don't need navies anymore. And the Navy was countering that, well, we don't really know what would happen. And so the Operations Crossroads tests were both an opportunity to sort of test to see what would happen to ships if atomic weapons went off in their proximity. And so they had a number of ships that had basically gone through their useful life, and so they were brought out. It included 4 battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, the Independence, a light aircraft carrier, and the USS Saratoga, which we'll come back to as well. And they arrayed these ships for 2 tests. One, the Able test, which was meant to be an airdrop, and this is the arrangement here. Again, this was not just done willy-nilly. They had very precise arrangements. They wanted to look at ships of same types at different distances from the blast, they had to make the case for, why were they just, blowing these up? And then they said, well, it's, these are basically scrap metal anyways. This is a picture of the Able test. And it wasn't just the ships that they were testing what would happen, but they wanted to test the impacts of these atomic weapons on living organisms. So they brought all manners of, they brought rats and goats and pigs and other animals that were tied to the decks of these ships, and sailors had to prep them. There were some 40,000 troops that were assembled, and not only was there this test fleet that was going to be part of the kill zone, but then there were additional ships that were brought in to help prep the site. And amazingly enough, a lot of documentary efforts were put into this. In fact, the estimates I've heard are that fully 50% of the film available on the planet was brought to Bikini to set up in different camera systems, either staged on the islands or from planes. They had early drone planes and early drone boats that were brought in as well to try to go in and document the conditions there. This is Admiral Blandy, and he was the one who was orchestrating and directing the entire operation. This is his wife, and I think this was a cake that they cut at the time. There was very much this. I guess an admiration with the bomb, which is sort of presented here in this cake, which I think over the years I think is maybe not hasn't stood up so well in time, particularly as her hat seems to sort of match that. And in one of the more lasting and sad aspects, particularly apt here as we are in Memorial Day weekend, was that one of the groups that become very, very much sort of victimized by this testing were the sailors who were there and who were brought back out to try to clean these ships after these testing, and many of them ended up developing cancers and sicknesses many years later because of their exposure to the radiation. It was thought at the time that they might be able to just wash off the ships and then reuse them for other sort of target practice, but particularly from the Baker blast, because the radiation, because the bomb vaporized water and all these little water droplets that came raining down, it made all the ships very much too hot. So just to give you some perspective and sense of Bikini for us in this region, of course, my team and I we're going from Delaware, and way out here in a remote area of the Marshall Islands, almost half a world away. Certainly the most farthest, most remote area that we've ever had to work. It took us fully 6 days to get there between flights and boat trips. We had to fly out to Hawaii, and then from Hawaii to Majuro in the Marshall Islands, and then it was a 4.5 day steam from Majuro. And I think for many of us, at least my sort of concept was, I would think, Pacific atolls, these must be tiny. This is quite large, just for context relative to Delaware. It's about 50 miles, almost 50 miles across, and very broad, large, and actually fairly deep lagoon here. And we weren't going to try to map the whole of the lagoon. We would have needed several months, but instead we focused on the areas associated with the atomic bomb testing. So like I said, half of the adventure was even just getting there. There's only a few ships that are allowed and have special approval from the Marshallese, from the Bikinians to have access to, and one of those is a group called the Indies Trader, and they operate a ship called the Indies Surveyor that lead dive operations. So it's Bikini is well known, and many other sites in the Marshall Islands like Kwajalein and other sites are well known to divers and particularly to wreck divers. And Bikini really is perhaps one of the most amazing collections of underwater ships that one could want to explore. But for us, it was almost about an 830 kilometer steam from Majuro against the prevailing trade winds. So it took us about 60 hours of slow going to even get there. Now, I operate a robotics lab, and we use all manner of underwater, surface, and aerial robots to map our coastlines. These are some of the folks in our team, and ideally I would have loved to have taken as many of those things as possible, but being it was very remote, we were very limited on what we could take. So we had to pare down to the most portable assortment that we could. We had to advance ship things because we knew that there was going to be no going to a local hardware store, no going to going to electronics store. We needed to bring everything with us and with as much fallback redundancy as we could, knowing that we had one shot at doing this. So we brought an assortment of underwater robots and aerial drones, and primarily sonar systems to use to be able to map the seafloor, because we really wanted to reveal what the seabed looks like. Now, normally we would do this off of very sophisticated research vessels. In this case, what we had was an 18-foot aluminum tender used for surfing and dive operations. So we had to turn this tin boat into an advanced mapping system, and basically sight unseen. So it was a real challenge for the folks on my team, the engineers and scientists, to be able to put together everything we would need, hope that our gear would get there. We had to ship in advance, hope that it would arrive, assemble all of our gear in Majuro, make sure we could do some initial testing, make sure everything worked, then disassemble, pack everything away for 60-hour steam, until we got back onto site, hoping that everything didn't get too beaten up in the transit. It was a it was a very rough transit. And then when we got there to Bikini, we then had to reassemble all of our equipment to ready ourselves for doing the seafloor mapping, which again is sort of shown behind me, and then became the basis for the Drain the Ocean series. And, you know, there's a lot of things that we take for granted. We do a lot of this kind of seafloor mapping in our own local waters, in the mid-Atlantic, in Delaware Bay, Chesapeake Bay, up and down the East Coast. And when we do that, we take advantage of the fact that we have really good tide stations. We have GPS correction stations that we can work from. Being very remote there in Bikini, we didn't have those things. So we had to bring sensors to measure our tides. We had to use satellite corrections and kind of make the most of that. And what it resulted in here is the first map of what the first comprehensive map of what the seafloor at Bikini looked like. And this was by far the most remote operations my group had ever conducted. It was months of planning, 6.5 days to get there. And we only had an 8-day period once we were on site to try to map this entire area for relative size. It's about 1.4, about 1.5 times the size of Central Park. And I think if I had to ask folks, where do you think an atomic bomb went off? It doesn't take much imagination to realize that it's right here. You can see this dent on the seafloor that looks like Captain Marvel herself has punched a dent in the side of the planet. And this was an amazing find for us. We had no clues or real expectation that might still be there. The only other time a team had come and done some survey work there was a team from the National Park Service and the Navy in the late 80s and early 90s, and they did some dive operations, and they dove on many of the wrecks here, which are labeled here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about a few of them, including the Gilliam, particularly the Gilliam and the Saratoga. But they didn't recall, they knew where the Baker crater was, but their sonar systems couldn't pick out this crater here. I mark with a star here. This is where the Able blast ended up occurring. It was actually off target. It was meant to have detonated over the USS Nevada, which I have a 3D model of right here, which interestingly enough was found just within the last couple of weeks off of the coast of Oahu, Hawaii. It was meant to have detonated over this battleship, but the bomb drifted about 1/4 mile from its site and instead blew up about 500 feet over the attack transporter USS Gilliam. But there's no evidence of a Able crater on the seafloor, but there's this very visible Baker crater, about 800 meters across. It's about the size of 3 of the Roman Colosseums, and the depth of about the height of a 13-story building. And within this relatively small area, I mean, I sort of imagine myself trying to walk through Central Park and having, 12 shipwrecks at your disposal. It includes many U.S. ships, also 2 Japanese ships, the battle cruiser, the Sakawa, and the battleship Nagato, and that was a very historically significant one. The Nagato was Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, and from which he led, orchestrated, and called on the attack on Pearl Harbor. So Nagato was seized by the U.S. in Tokyo Harbor at the end of the war and was dragged out to Bikini, very much to be ceremoniously or unceremoniously sacrificed to this atomic bomb testing, to serve as a real period exclamation point for the treachery that was involved in its role in Pearl Harbor, and it lies there now. Still. And what you're looking at here is almost 20 million points that provide the sounding of the seafloor. And it's a mix of human targets from the shipwrecks, but also there are these very large natural coral heads, some of them even larger, taller than the ships themselves. And here I have a 3D print of that sort of that seabed area. And so for us, it was amazing to be able to sort of put this together to not only map the trees, as it were, of the shipwrecks, but to actually put them in the context of the surrounding natural environment, and to try to do as much detail work around these ships as we could. And so let's take a little deeper dive into it. So here is a 3D rendering of that side. I'll pause it there for a moment. And if we look here, very prominently is the USS Saratoga, the battleship just outside of the Baker crater. We also have the USS Arkansas battleship there. And hard to actually even resolve because they're so low relief. There are actually two ships that are actually within the crater, a submarine, the USS Pilotfish, and this battle cruiser, the Sakawa. And the National Park Service and the Navy team, when they went there in the late 80s, early 90s, couldn't find the Sakawa because it was so, they had trouble finding it because it was so low relief there. And here is a cross section across that, across the crater. We see sort of the outline of it. Some of it is partially filled in because all the, so we're not seeing the fullness of the crater because some of the sediment that fell back in on this, but this was the first time that we're actually really able to place this in context, and it's really helped inform and update our interpretation and our understanding of what transpired when that testing went on. And I'll get into that a little bit. In fact, one of the things we did is we took a little deeper dive. If we take a further analytical look, and instead of just looking at the color, here the depth is shown as color. Here now in this map, instead, what we do is we look at the slope at every point. And when we do that, it reveals something else entirely that we hadn't expected to see, and that there are these subtle concentric features that are radiating out from the crater. And this was an astounding discovery for us because this let us see that there are these completely unexpected, clearly concentric and coherent bed forms that are associated with the Baker crater. So we're actually seeing a snapshot, a frozen moment from 1946 from that testing that shows us what the distortions to the seabed that were caused by that testing. And we can look across those. If we take a zoom in here, here's the USS Pilotfish. So we've got the submarine that's about 500 feet long for scale. And here are some of these bed forms that are radiating up from it. And this it's again, to imagine like a giant pebble being dropped. And we see in the videos from the time, the tsunami waves across the surface of the water, but the same sort of thing was going on at the seabed, and it's left these patterns on the seabed that are traced out by the magnitude of that flow. And this is the world's first underwater test of a nuclear weapon. These are the first atomic bomb craters. And I particularly want to highlight the Pilotfish because the Pilotfish was held in the middle of the water column, and they had pressure sensors on the Pilotfish and other ships. And pressure readings on the Pilotfish recorded peak pressures of more than 5,200 pounds per square inch as the radiating pulse from the atomic bomb blast went off. And that's almost orders of magnitude more powerful than the pressure that the hull was designed to take. So it just, in fact, when divers went down and we looked at the Pilotfish, it looks like it was shrink wrapped. It was actually just compressed like sausage, or somebody had squeezed some dough. And so much so that the torpedo tubes, that 18-inch torpedo tubes that would have been about 4 feet separated from each other are now almost practically kissing. They're almost adjacently abutting themselves, and it speaks to the power of that blast. So these bed forms, which immediately garnered a lot of my attention, because as an oceanographer, as a geological oceanographer, one of the things I most study is how waves and currents and storms and other processes leave the signature on the seabed. These are what geologists use to help interpret the past, whether we're trying to understand the past on our planet or understanding bed forms and dunes on Mars. We look at bed forms and we try to infer the flow around them. Well, we've never before had the opportunity to see and try to interpret bed forms associated with atomic bombs. So this is something we're still scratching our heads on to try to understand these. And so we've been looking at analogs to volcanic collapse bed forms. Tsunami derived bed forms are kind of the closest things that we can look to try to understand these. Again, these were really not reported or known when the team started looking at these in the late 80s and early 90s when they first went to the site. So I want to now take a little deeper dive into some of these wrecks and show you the ways in which we utilize both the acoustic data and also the way we use some of our optical systems to reconstruct in great detail these sites. And one of the ships that's highlighted in the Drain the Ocean series on Nat Geo is the USS Gilliam, and it's kind of considered sort of the forgotten ship. This was a TAC transporter. It was, forgive my dog there. It was not intended to be the ship to be at the ground zero attack. That was meant to be the Nevada. But here, when we got down and started looking at the site, and I have it here in 3D, it was something unlike anything we'd ever seen, because what was unbelievable to us is that it looked like we were looking at a melted chocolate bar or cake fondant that was sort of in various folds, and to realize that we're looking at 4-inch thick steel. And here are some divers here, and it just kind of looks like a deflated clown shoe or something, and that's from the intense pressure and heat associated with the blast. So when we look at the positioning of the Gilliam, it's just sort of melted and conformed to the seafloor. And that's because of the blast ended up going off right on top of it. It kind of got flash melted and pulverized by the pressure from the bomb pushing down on it. A similar fate happened to the Saratoga, which was the largest ship that was brought in, CV3, which is USS Saratoga, Lexington class aircraft carrier. It has the record for having had more planes take off from her deck than any other aircraft carrier in history. She was brought out to the site with aircraft and other vehicles on her decks. This is what she looked like at the time, and she's now sitting on the seafloor in about 160 feet of water, 180 feet of water, and sitting upright on the deck. And we actually placed our tide gauge stations right up here in the control island. The smokestack is gone, and as you'll see, the site is very much degraded relative to that. We can still see parts of her. There's the island. We can see the elevator shaft in the middle, but this whole back section of the deck has collapsed, and all along the starboard side that was facing towards the crater, there are washboard ripples caused from the atomic blast. The 8-inch deck guns are still there. And here also on the deck, we saw some of the instrumentation. These were known as Christmas trees. These were some of the instruments that were placed on these ships to record the conditions, to measure temperatures, to measure pressures. And it was after the Baker blast, it was because of the Baker blast that the Saratoga sank to the seabed. But we can see astounding detail from our sonar mapping of the site, and this allowed us to compare to the drawings done by the Park Service folks in 1989. I'll show you just a little bit of video here as we're diving around the deck. You can see this major collapse here in the deck structure, and the part of the reason for that is that it was close enough, and the Saratoga was actually where it's found now is twice as far away from the blast as she was at the time. She got pulled from her mooring from these giant waves that pushed her, broke her free from her mooring. And as the rain and cloud of sand and coral and everything came crashing down, it fell and pulverized, pushed onto the deck and helped weaken the deck. And that weakness has been exploited over the years to lead to some of that collapse. As an interesting coda, and I want to mention briefly, and this has just come out in the news in the last couple of weeks. And at the end of April, a team operating out of Hawaii with Ocean Infinity and Search Inc., there were partners involved in some of the work we do, actually found the Nevada. This was the color it was painted at the time of Bikini. The Nevada actually survived both the Able and the Baker test, but was too radiated from Baker to have been of much more use. So the Navy dragged her out to Hawaii and used it for target practice. And she lay there undiscovered until just a few weeks ago. And so we now have, even more recently, another added addition to it. And now I want to fast forward a little bit. So we want to go from those tests in 1946. That wasn't the end of the testing in Bikini. In 1954, the military came back and conducted an additional set of testing from 54 up to 58. And one of the major tests that was done in 54 was part of a series called Castle series. And this is the video of the Castle Bravo test here. This was not a fission bomb as the 46 tests were. This was a hydrogen fusion bomb, and it still remains the largest nuclear weapon that the U.S. has ever tested. It was a 15 megaton bomb, whereas the ones in 46 were 25 kilotons. This was the video from it. The Soviets at this time, by this point, had also their own nuclear weapons and responded with the testing of a 50 megaton bomb called Tsar Bomba. And it was in the response to those sets of testing that they then did a ban on above ground testing and went to below ground testing. And so one of the tasks we wanted to do was to investigate the Castle Bravo test. And you can see the crater even from space. If you go into Google Earth, you can zoom in there. So we knew this. In fact, there are several other craters. Something to keep in mind is there were a total of 23 nuclear bombs tested in Bikini. And so we very much wanted to go and investigate Castle Bravo once we had completed our work to the eastern side for the Crossroads tests. And so we had one day really to try to map that. And what we discovered, it was kind of always curious to us looking at the satellite images, that why it wasn't this a circular crater, rather it kind of looked oblong. And that's because it became very evident as we started a map, we could realize that it wasn't just one crater we were seeing, but there are two craters adjacent to each other, the larger Castle Bravo and another in the Castle series, Castle Romeo. Both of these were hydrogen bomb tests. So more than 1,400 meters in diameter. You could fit 4 of the Eiffel Towers here across into this. And the astounding thing and the real heart-wrenching thing for us is as we were going back and forth with our little boat mapping the seafloor to map this crater, is the realization that had we been there in 1946, we would have been walking on dry land. There were 3 little islands here, completely vaporized. And in talking to some Bikini descendants in Majuro, one gentleman we spoke to said his wife's family had lived on an island in here, and that island no longer exists. And just to give you some sense of scale, and this was similar to some graphics that the State Department, that the War Department did at the time. The Baker crater relative to the Pentagon is shown here in red, and this green circle is the size of the Castle Bravo crater, just to give you some sense of the scale on those. So, just to kind of summarize, the takeaways here is that Bikini Atoll was a site of 23 nuclear bomb testings between 1946 and 58, where they tested, the impacts of the atomic bombs on ships, and left behind numerous anthropogenic craters on the seafloor. Our project work here, the work that went into the Drain the Oceans series, represented the first comprehensive sonar and geophysical mapping surveys of both the Operations Crossroads sites and the Castle Bravo area. And we discovered some new things. We discovered that the Baker crater is still present, still visible, and that there are these bomb-derived bed forms that I hadn't seen before. For the Castle Bravo site, we're able to now sort of build a full, complete model of the crater on the seafloor there that destroyed 3 islands, and that what's sombering about all this is that it shows that even now this year, 74 years later, the scars just below the surface on the seabed in Bikini are still there, and still very visible reminders to us to the heavy toll that was extracted on the environment and to humankind, because to the Bikinians who remain displaced and affected by this testing, and also to the service men and women who were there and exposed to some of the radiation from those fallout testing. So I think particularly apt here with Memorial Weekend that we try to reconnect and remember what Bikini represents. I think for many of the Marshallese, for the Bikinians themselves, they take some solace in the fact that while they have lost their lands and remain displaced and have suffered sicknesses at very high levels from radiation exposure, we still have remained in this longest period of peace, where at least the nuclear weapons haven't been used in anger by any of the superpowers, and we certainly hope that would continue. So that's kind of this sort of quick guided tour of the Bikini Atoll and the atomic bomb testing there. And I think with that, I will stop my share and open up to questions.
So my first question is going to be, if you don't mind, are you going to be joining us on Discord? Because we have an amazing amount of really good questions in your Q&A, but you're running out of time.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be absolutely. I'd be happy to pop over to Discord. I guess we just have maybe find a suitable select a suitable room to
Not a problem. I will send a link over to you so that way it will alert you to where you're going to be.
Okay.
And what I'll do is I'll screen share the location so everybody knows where to join us.
Great.
And while we give another couple of moments for that, let's take a quick look at the Q&A and see if we have something we can quickly talk about. Do you see any signs of sea life that have been affected by the radiation?
That's an excellent question. I mean, we certainly had some concerns going into this. And what is perhaps most astounding is how well nature has recovered. And perhaps the biggest reason for that is because it has become an amazing natural reserve. It's basically a marine protected area. No fishing is allowed or has been allowed in the intervening 74 years. So we saw amazing coral cover. A lot of growth on the ships themselves. The fish populations were large. We saw particularly a lot of large predators. Every time we went into the water and dove, we saw sharks, tiger sharks, and others in the waters. And so, the marine life has really recovered in ways much more so than the recovery, in fact, that's gone on land. In fact, the radiation levels accumulated on land still prevent habitation on the island. There is a Department of Energy field station there, and they monitor radiation levels. And the problem on land is that there's still enough in the soil that it accumulates into the coconuts, coconut trees into the coconuts, and into the coconut crabs eat the coconuts. And so it's really not possible for people to be able to live there. Water has had an amazing effect of being able to help absorb and dispel the radiation levels. So we had dosimeters with us, all of us on our team, as part of our health and human safety going into this. And in fact, the radiation levels that we experienced were less than you might experience walking around Manhattan, or the kinds of equivalents you might get exposed to in a modern urban setting. So the marine environment's made an amazing recovery there.
Very good. I think I'll do just one more question, because
Sure.
we're a little bit over time at this
Okay.
point. Do you have online files for doing the 3D prints that you've been showing? Do you have those accessible for folks?
Right, that's excellent question. We hadn't made them publicly available because we had been waiting for the Drain the Ocean series to come out. So I would be willing to make those available, but I probably actually need to check with the production company. One of the things I've been really trying to advocate for to the production company and to Nat Geo and up the line to Disney is that if you've seen the series, it's a really great series, that the CGI work is really amazing. And being a seafloor mapper, what astounded me is how faithfully they honor our bathymetric data in constructing. They actually, I learned from the production company, the CGI team makes 2 models for every ship. They make a pristine model, and then they make a distorted model. So in the case of the Saratoga, they make a pristine model, and then they distort that model, they beat it up, they tear it apart to make it match what our seafloor map looks like. And then in the series, you get one rendering of that. And what I would really love for them to be able to do is release those so that we could explore those in Oculus or virtual reality environments, because that would really enable folks to explore these realms. It's something we do here in our lab, but I'll have to see if I can get permission to share those, because we'd certainly love to make those available to folks. We've been having a lot of fun printing them ourselves.
That sounds delightful. All